The Harvard professor pointed at Elijah's handmade tree topper and laughed. Not softly, but loud enough for the entire school gym to freeze. "This belongs in a trash bin," he scoffed. As cameras rolled and parents stared, Elijah didn't move, didn't cry, just watched as his tribute to his late father was publicly mocked. But that night, the world saw what Harvard didn't, and by morning, 13 million people had already chosen sides. The first snow of December fell quietly over Dorchester, dusting the cracked sidewalks and rusted fire escapes in a thin white coat. Inside a weathered red brick apartment building, the Carters' living room flickered with soft yellow light from a half-decorated Christmas tree that leaned slightly to one side. The star meant for the top lay shattered on the floor, a casualty of a careless reach. Elijah Carter, 14, stared at the shards like they had betrayed him. But then, with a slow exhale and a look toward the ceiling, he turned to his late father's toolbox sitting in the corner, untouched since the funeral. It was time to build something new. Elijah didn't see himself as a genius. He didn't even think he was particularly creative. What he had was curiosity and grief that never quite left his chest. He missed his father most during the holidays, not just for the warmth, but the way his father, a former lab tech and tinkerer, made everything feel like a science project waiting to happen. That night, Elijah spread cardboard, copper wire, old flashlight bulbs, and tiny glass fragments across the kitchen table. For hours, he cut, soldered, and wired. His mother, Vanessa, peeked in once, offered cocoa, then left him alone with his storm of thought. What emerged wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was angular, abstract, 2 DNA strands coiled in copper, spiraling into wings made of bent coat hangers, with tiny LED lights blinking rhythmically at its core. Elijah smiled faintly. It wasn't a star. It was something more personal, more alive. His father had taught him that every strand of DNA carried history. These wings? They carried legacy. At Parker Middle School, the winter showcase was usually a forgettable event. Paper snowflakes, glitter glue, and a surplus of Santa hats. But this year, the school had invited a guest, Dr. Grant Ellison, an art aesthetics professor from Harvard, known for his sharp critiques and sharper tongue. Elijah had no idea who he was. He just knew his tree topper was different. It didn't sparkle. It didn't sing carols. It didn't match anything in the cafeteria turned gallery. But it was his. As students set up their glittery displays, Elijah found the smallest corner, near a drooping fir branch and a flickering strand of lights. He placed the topper gently on a small stand. Some students glanced at it and smirked. Others walked past without a second look. But Elijah kept his eyes low, his mind focused on what the piece meant to him, not what it looked like to them. Then came the laugh, sharp, loud, and deliberate. Dr. Ellison had paused at Elijah's table. He tilted his head, examining the piece with exaggerated curiosity, then turned to a nearby teacher and said, "What is this? Industrial waste? Or did someone drop their science fair project by mistake?" The laugh that followed was dry and practiced, the kind that stripped skin without leaving a visible mark. A few students laughed nervously. Others looked away. Elijah froze. The professor crouched, inspecting it further. I see. A homemade attempt at symbolism, perhaps. Primitive, but enthusiastic. The words were spat like venom wrapped in politeness. He stood up, waved his hand dismissively, and moved on to a snowman made of glitter balls. The silence around Elijah's table was deafening. His hands clenched into fists. His chest rose in shallow breaths, but he never looked up. He didn't need to. The shame pressed against his skin like cold metal. He heard someone whisper, "That's the Harvard guy," like it was supposed to mean something. Vanessa had arrived halfway through the showcase, just in time to see the last few seconds of the encounter. She wasn't close enough to hear, but she saw the smirk, the dismissive hand wave, and the way her son stood too still. Her heart tightened. She pulled out her phone and began recording, catching just enough of the professor's next remark at another table to stitch the moment together later. Back home, Elijah sat on the couch in silence. The topper was in his lap. He hadn't said a word since they left the school. Vanessa stood in the kitchen, staring at her phone. She watched the video again, then again. Every second twisted her stomach tighter. That man didn't just mock a project, he mocked her son's voice, his grief, his expression. Her jaw tightened. She uploaded the clip to her barely used TikTok account, with a short caption, "Harvard professor mocks 14-year-old's tree topper. This is what racism looks like in schools." Then she closed the app and went to sit beside Elijah, wrapping her arm around him. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the snow kept falling. Vanessa didn't expect anything to come from the post. Maybe a few supportive comments. Maybe nothing. But the internet moves like wildfire when injustice meets raw truth. By midnight, the video had over 100,000 views. By morning, it would be on national news. But the real reason it caught fire wasn't just the cruelty. It was what people saw when they looked closer at the topper. Because in that mess of wire and light, people saw more than a student's project. They saw defiance, genius, and something Harvard hadn't expected to be outshined by a boy from Dorchester. That same night, Elijah's tree topper was about to go viral for a reason no one saw coming. The video did not begin with theatrics or dramatic camera movement. It began with the uneasy quiet of a school cafeteria filled with paper decorations and forced cheer, the kind of space that pretended to celebrate creativity while quietly deciding who was allowed to be considered talented. The frame shook slightly in Vanessa Carter's unsteady hands, capturing the blur of lights, tinsel, and children standing beside their projects with rigid shoulders and nervous smiles. The laughter that followed, the same brittle, dismissive sound Elijah had stood beneath, sliced through the space and carried that humiliation far beyond the room's wall. The previous section had ended at the instant the world had not yet reacted. Now the night stretched forward like a fuse catching fire. Dr. Grant Ellison did not see himself as cruel. In his mind, he represented refinement, a man trained to separate what he called high art from aspirational attempts. He stood with perfectly measured posture, a coat collar turned sharply upward against the cold, his expression carved into permanent superiority. When he paused again near Elijah's table, the small corner display that did not glitter like the others, his mouth carried that same thin amusement. He leaned forward and made his comment with an ease that revealed habit, not accident. The sentence floated across the showcase like a quiet wound, and although its tone remained outwardly polite, the subtext carried years of unchallenged entitlement. He believed his judgment was culture. Elijah's project to him was an interruption. The parents nearest the table felt the air shift first. A mother holding a cup of cocoa lowered it slightly, unsure whether to react or pretend not to have heard. A teacher tightened her grip around a clipboard, her eyes moving between the professor and the boy, with the copper-winged topper. Students tried to laugh in small, nervous bursts, unsure whether they were allowed to dispose of a Harvard visitor. In the middle of that frozen tension, Elijah remained perfectly still, not because he was unbothered, but because he had learned too early how to become invisible when someone with authority decided his work did not belong in the room. Vanessa stood a few steps away, absorbing the rupture second by second. She noticed the way Dr. Ellison's expression shifted from curiosity to ridicule, the way he tilted his head as if studying an object rather than acknowledging the child beside it. She did not hear every word, but she saw the way Elijah's shoulders contracted, how his fingers curled inward slightly around nothing at all. The motivation to record was not for spectacle but for memory, a quiet instinct to document what power looks like when it does not expect to be challenged. Her heart tightened as she realized this moment would follow him, whether the room forgot it or not. When they returned home, the silence carried the weight of something unfinished. Elijah did not cry or argue. Instead, he withdrew into a stillness that felt heavier than anger. Vanessa replayed the footage while standing near the kitchen counter, the dim light reflecting across her tired eyes. Each second revealed details she had not noticed in the moment. The amused tilt of the professor's mouth, the subtle nods of approval from teachers too intimidated to intervene, the way the camera caught Elijah's face just before he lowered his gaze. The humiliation had not been loud or explosive. It had been quiet, intellectual, and precise, the kind of wound respected institutions often denied inflicting. Posting the clip was not impulsive. Vanessa hesitated, weighing the consequence of sharing her son's vulnerability with strangers. Yet the alternative, silence, felt like surrender. The caption emerged from a place somewhere between pain and defiance, not written to provoke outrage, but to name what others preferred to disguise as harmless critique. When she finally pressed upload, the act felt less like a call for attention, and more like a refusal to let the moment evaporate into the comfortable forgetfulness of privileged spaces. What neither she nor Elijah expected was how quickly the internet recognized itself in that small, shaky recording. Within the first hour, comments gathered cautiously at the edges, then swelled into collective memory. Stories of overlooked projects, dismissed brilliance, quiet bias disguised as academic rigor. The clip did not spread because people were shocked by cruelty. It spread because the cruelty was familiar. Each replay uncovered something layered within the piece itself. Viewers paused and zoomed into the copper coils, into the fragile, imperfect wings bending upward, into the pulsing lights at the center as if the ornament itself were breathing beneath criticism. While the numbers rose, a conversation ignited in unseen corners of the city. A teacher who had remained silent during the showcase sat in her car afterward, watching the video again, feeling the weight of her own inaction settle across her chest. A student who had laughed nervously at the moment replayed it on her phone, and realized the sound felt different outside the cafeteria, colder, sharper, unmistakably cruel. A local reporter scrolled past it instinctively, then paused, her attention caught not by outrage but by symbolism, a black boy's creation mocked under the gaze of an institution built on prestige. That night, the professor himself remained unaware of the storm gathering around him. Inside his office lined with polished wood and framed recognitions, he reflected briefly on the evening, recalling the projects that amused him, including the one made of wire and scrap. He justified his dismissiveness as academic honesty, convinced that criticism shaped excellence. He never imagined that the most powerful judgment of his career would come not from his peers, but from the eyes of millions beyond Harvard's gate. The unexpected twist was not the mockery, it was the fact that the ornament he had dismissed as worthless was beginning to be seen as something far more profound. As the clip spread across social platforms, someone slowed the footage and added subtitles, drawing attention to the strange contrast between the professor's polished posture and the fragility of the boy's project. A college student studying art theory stitched a response explaining how Elijah's design resembled a double helix wrapped in wings, symbolizing lineage and rise, something Dr. Ellison had failed to see. That interpretation caught momentum, reframing the ornament from childish craft to conceptual symbolism. What had been treated as scrap in the cafeteria became an emblem of misread intelligence and lazy elitism in the public eye. Meanwhile, Elijah remained seated on the couch, unaware of the growing conversation orbiting his work. He held the topper gently, as if it might break again, replaying the earlier moment, not through sound but through sensation. The subtle humiliation of being evaluated as less before being understood. His mother finally told him the video was spreading, not in a celebratory tone but with careful restraint, as though protecting him from hope that could still collapse. The revelation did not thrill him, it unsettled him. The idea that strangers now witnessed his vulnerability felt both comforting and invasive, like the world had entered a private room without knocking. The tension deepened when reactions divided across familiar fault lines. Some viewers defended the professor, claiming he had only offered critique, arguing that art required resilience. Others saw the subtle racism, not in the words themselves but in the assumption that creativity from a black student in a public school deserved mockery rather than inquiry. Comment threads turned into cultural battlegrounds. Yet through the noise, the ornament remained at the center, pulsing quietly with meaning no one had expected to confront. By the early hours of the morning, the clip crossed a threshold from viral moment to national narrative. Activist pages shared it, educators dissected it, and alumni from elite institutions began recounting parallel experiences, revealing a pattern hidden beneath polished academic reputations. The story was no longer about a single comment in a school cafeteria. It had become a window into who was allowed to be seen as gifted, and who was reduced to novelty. And then, somewhere between midnight and dawn, something even more startling happened. A small account belonging to an art historian reposted the clip with a thread analyzing the piece's structural choices. The wires forming a helix, the wings curving upward, the light at the center flickering like breath. Her final observations suggested that Elijah's topper was not merely decorative, but conceptual, echoing motifs used in contemporary sculpture. That interpretation shattered the narrative of childish craft and reframed the humiliation entirely. The mockery had not targeted mediocrity. It had misread brilliance. By the time Vanessa refreshed the app again, the view count had shifted from thousands to millions. The numbers climbed rapidly, comments multiplying faster than she could read, her chest filling with equal parts dread and astonishment. The world had not simply witnessed what happened. It had decided to respond to it. Elijah glanced at her screen, stunned not by the attention, but by the realization that the moment he wished had never happened was now unfolding everywhere. The storm had begun, and its direction was no longer in anyone's control. The clip was uploaded to TikTok, and within hours it exploded. The moment the clock struck 6:13 a.m., Vanessa Carter's phone buzzed so violently, it clattered off the nightstand. She barely opened her eyes before grabbing it, her sleep interrupted by a deluge of notifications, news alerts and direct messages. Her hand trembled as she scrolled through the chaos. Overnight, something had shifted. What had started as a shaky video of a humiliating moment had grown into a national spectacle. The clip had crossed 13 million views. 13 million. Elijah, still wrapped in his blanket on the couch, blinked slowly awake as the glow of his mother's phone lit up the room. His eyes adjusted, but what they landed on wasn't the tree, or the handmade topper, or the dusty television. It was her face. Stunned. Disbelieving. Slowly, he sat up. Elijah, baby, it's everywhere, Vanessa whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief. CNN, The Root, NPR, even celebrities are reposting it. The world, it seemed, had taken a collective pause to stare into a moment that spoke far beyond a child's school project. It wasn't just about one laugh, one boy, one ornament. It was about the deeper wound, the centuries-long pattern of brilliance being ridiculed, because it didn't come in the expected form. Elijah's humiliation had become a mirror for a million others. A journalist from a major online platform had taken the liberty of uploading a slowed, zoomed version of the original clip, highlighting the moment Dr. Ellison's eyes narrowed in amusement just before delivering his now infamous line. They paired it with a headline that hit like a hammer. Harvard professor laughs at black teen's tribute to his dead father. Internet declares it a work of genius. That phrasing exploded across timelines like shrapnel. The story wasn't just viral, it had become moral currency. On Twitter, two hashtags dominated the feed: Elijah's star and Jamed Harvard humiliation. One was celebratory, the other condemnatory. Together they framed the divide. People on one side argued for academic freedom, the right to critique, the sanctity of standards, but the louder, angrier chorus called it for what it was: intellectual gatekeeping weaponized to humiliate, racial bias cloaked in polite vocabulary. Celebrities reposted the clip, some adding their own childhood memories of being shamed in classrooms, others pledging to uplift black creativity wherever they saw it. Activists framed the moment within the larger context of how educational elitism often served as a mask for prejudice. Even elected officials tweeted cryptically about needing a cultural audit in elite spaces. But the unexpected twist came when art and design communities began dissecting Elijah's tree topper itself. Images of the ornament, which Vanessa had posted in a follow-up video, began circulating rapidly. Artists and curators zoomed into the details, the copper coils forming a double helix, the wings constructed with bent hangers, the soft pulses of light at the core. A renowned sculptor from Brooklyn posted, "This is not just a tree topper. This is conceptual sculpture. This is grief turned into geometry. This is brilliance." Others echoed the sentiment, calling it symbolic engineering, Afrofuturist craftsmanship, outsider art with insider complexity. One art critic wrote a full essay titled "The Boy Who Built Legacy from Scrap," analyzing every angle, connecting it to ancestral iconography and visual metaphor. The essay gained traction fast. It framed Elijah not as a victim of humiliation, but as a prodigy accidentally Suddenly, everyone wanted to see the tree topper up close. Messages flooded in, from museums, galleries, cultural centers, even Ivy League professors disavowing Dr. Ellison. Vanessa received hundreds of interview requests. Schools asked if Elijah could speak at their student assemblies. But amid the media noise, something rare happened. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't even celebrate. He was overwhelmed. While the world framed him as a symbol of strength and genius, he sat quietly in his living room, trying to reconcile the trauma of being mocked with the praise now pouring in. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like exposure. Being turned into a movement didn't heal the sting of that moment. It amplified it. Vanessa noticed. She pulled him into the kitchen, away from the buzz of notifications. She spoke softly, her voice carrying both pride and worry. "You don't owe them anything, Eli. Not your art, not your story, not your piece. This moment is yours. No one gets to rewrite it without you." Elijah didn't respond right away. Then, without looking up, he said, "They only care now because everyone's watching, not because they saw it before." It was a haunting truth. His piece had existed before the virality. It had been powerful before the validation, but no one had noticed until they saw him hurt. Then came the email. A short 2-line message from an anonymous sender with a verified domain and no signature. "We'd like to acquire the original tree topper for $50,000. Discretion is expected. No public credit required." Vanessa gasped when she read it aloud. Elijah stared at the screen. $50,000. For a piece he had made from scrap, grief and a handful of broken parts. The kind of offer families like theirs couldn't afford to laugh at. But Elijah didn't need time to think. "No," he said softly but firmly. "It's not for sale." Vanessa turned to him startled. "Eli, are you sure?" I said no," he repeated. "If they don't want people to know it was me, then they don't want it for the right reason." That answer stunned her into silence. Elijah wasn't just refusing the money. He was refusing to be erased from his own story. It was a declaration, quiet but unshakable. Later that evening, Vanessa posted a screenshot of the offer, redacted but recognizable, with a single sentence: "We're not selling our story, we're reclaiming it." That post alone hit nearly 1 million likes in under an hour. What none of them knew was that the anonymous buyer wasn't just a collector. He had a connection to Harvard, and a deeper interest in silencing the story before it reached places money couldn't shield. An anonymous donor offered $50,000 for Elijah's tree topper, but he refused. The topper sat on a folded piece of black velvet, illuminated by the light of a borrowed ring lamp in the Carters' modest living room. A friend of Vanessa's, who freelanced in product photography, had offered to shoot high-res images of Elijah's ornament, just for documentation. But when the first photo hit social media, it did more than document. It detonated the myth that it was simply a scrap project. People didn't just look. They studied. The strands of coiled copper formed two perfectly proportioned spirals, gently curving in opposite directions, like mirrored flames. At their center pulsed a soft white light, embedded inside a clear resin orb, which glowed with a warm, living energy. The wings, fashioned from bent wire hangers and covered in feather-shaped slivers of recycled foil, fanned out with architectural precision, and somehow, the entire piece balanced delicately on a base built from broken glass and a piece of Elijah's father's old microscope stand. The symbolism wasn't merely aesthetic. It was layered, intentional, and deeply personal. The DNA strand honored his father, Thomas Carter, who had worked quietly in a community clinic's research lab, largely unknown to the academic world but celebrated in their neighborhood for explaining complex science to kids like Elijah in plain human language. The wings, as Vanessa later explained in an interview, weren't just spiritual. They were hers. Faith had carried her through the loss, through the bills and grief, and a son whose silence had grown heavier each day since his father passed. Elijah had fused both legacies into a single object, never intending to be profound. He had simply wanted to feel connected to both of them again, at once. But now the world wanted more. A prominent engineering professor from MIT reposted the close-up image with a breakdown of the materials, commenting, "This is not child's play. This is structural logic applied with intuitive genius." An art historian from UCLA went further, arguing that Elijah's work echoed elements of the African-American vernacular art tradition, a form long dismissed by white institutions for its use of found materials, despite being rich with cultural memory and social critique. What had been dismissed in a Harvard professor's cold chuckle was now being hailed as a conceptual masterpiece. The pressure began mounting on Harvard. At first, their silence was strategic. Perhaps they hoped the story would pass like most viral moments, replaced by the next outrage. But that silence became its own indictment. The public began to ask hard questions. How had an institution claiming intellectual excellence missed what the streets, schools, and scholars were now calling a seminal work of modern youth expression? It wasn't just a scandal, it was an exposure. Vanessa, meanwhile, found herself trapped in an emotional paradox. She was proud, but cautious. She watched networks request interviews, and media producers pitch documentaries like it was content, not consequence. The calls came with flattering words, but behind them she felt the push. Package the pain, tell the story, then let it go. But there was no letting go for her son. Elijah hadn't asked to be anyone's symbol, and while the world marveled at his hands, they ignored the heaviness in his eyes, the gaze of a boy who had always been looked at, but rarely seen. One night, Vanessa sat beside Elijah on the couch. He was quietly sketching something new, his fingers moving automatically, his eyes half-focused. "I read someone called your topper post-traumatic design," she said softly. Elijah didn't look up. "What does that even mean?" She hesitated. "I think they meant, it's beautiful because it came from pain." He stopped drawing, the pencil freezing mid-arc. "That's not why I made it," he whispered. "I made it because I couldn't talk about him anymore." The room thickened with silence. It was a reminder that beyond the headlines, there lived a grieving child, not a prodigy, not a brand, just a boy who missed his father, and used broken things to feel less broken himself. But that tender truth wasn't the story Harvard had to answer for. As pressure escalated, Harvard's PR team released a carefully worded statement. We regret the recent incident involving Professor Ellison's remarks at a public school event. The university is committed to fostering creativity in all forms and upholding dignity and respect for all artists. It was a non-apology, vague, detached, and infuriating. The internet wasn't having it. Students at Harvard staged a small protest outside the Faculty of Arts building, holding signs that read, "Art isn't white, and respect is a curriculum too." And then came the moment that changed the narrative yet again. An alumna of Harvard, Dr. Rachel Linwood, a black visual artist and former top graduate of the Art and Visual Culture program, posted a thread that instantly reshaped the scandal. In it, she shared her experience with Dr. Ellison 10 years earlier. I was told by him that my senior thesis, which included family heirlooms and historical black textiles, was too emotional for an intellectual space. I wasn't allowed to present it at the main gallery. He called it cultural indulgence. I cried in his office. He told me to consider advertising instead of fine art. Attached were screenshots of old emails, grading rubrics, and even a portion of her thesis feedback. It was undeniable. The same man who had humiliated Elijah had a history of dismissing culturally rooted, emotionally charged black art as inferior. Her final tweet landed with the force of a sledgehammer. Harvard didn't miss Elijah's genius. They've been trained to ignore it for years. The backlash was immediate and sharp. Former students poured in with their own accounts, stories of minimized projects, backhanded critiques, and being told their cultural identity was not academically neutral. Some were black, others Latinx, a few were indigenous. The thread now had a life of its own. Elijah's story had cracked open a vault of suppressed academic racism. Harvard could no longer hide behind platitudes. This wasn't about one ornament anymore. It was about how many voices were treated as decoration rather than design. Meanwhile, Elijah remained at the center of a storm he never asked for. Interview offers turned into scholarship pitches. One Ivy League recruiter even reached out, offering early mentorship. Vanessa read the email aloud, her tone skeptical. They said they want to nurture your raw potential. Elijah didn't smile. I was potential last week. I'm only raw now because they saw the video. She nodded slowly, pride and fury twisting inside her. We're not letting them rewrite the story, but the story was still unraveling. That evening, as Rachel Linwood's revelations flooded the news cycle, a quiet knock came at the Carters' door. Vanessa opened it, confused to find a thin man in his late 40s, holding a folder under his arm. He introduced himself as Malcolm Reyes, a former classmate of Dr. Ellison, a Harvard alum. I saw the video, he said, and I know things about Ellison that Harvard never wanted public. Vanessa froze. Elijah stepped into the hallway, listening. Malcolm looked past her, directly at the boy whose art had stirred the nation. Dr. Ellison has a pattern, Malcolm said. But this time it's not going to disappear. I have proof he manipulated student evaluations to silence black critiques, mine included. And I'm not the only one. Vanessa narrowed her eyes. Why now? Malcolm didn't flinch, because Harvard's been silent long enough. And this time, they picked the wrong child to silence. A Harvard alum stepped forward and revealed a disturbing truth about Dr. Ellison's past. The knock at the door had not faded from Vanessa's ears when the weight of what Malcolm revealed began to take shape inside the apartment. His voice, steady and deliberate, did not carry anger as much as it carried exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years rehearsing truth in silence before finally allowing it into the air. Elijah stood near the edge of the hallway, gripping the back of a chair, absorbing every word with a quiet intensity. The revelations did not erase what had happened in the cafeteria. They expanded it, stretching the humiliation beyond one boy, one moment, into an entire system that had practiced exclusion like an art form. Malcolm opened the folder he had carried and placed photocopied receipts of history across the kitchen table. Evaluation reports marked with subtle language, overly personal, insufficiently academic, culturally narrow in scope. Terms that sounded harmless to the unfamiliar eye, but revealed themselves as coded rejections when read in sequence. He described how Ellison often praised abstraction when it came from students whose work detached itself from identity, yet dismissed projects rooted in heritage as subjective, sentimental, or lacking rigor. His tone remained calm, but each sentence landed like a steady hammer against denial. Vanessa listened without interruption, the faint hum of the refrigerator underscoring the confession like a low, persistent note. Rachel Linwood's story had ignited the first fracture. Now Malcolm's records brought structure to the wound. He recounted the moment his own thesis, a mixed media exploration of migration and labor, had been described by Dr. Ellison as sociology disguised as art. Malcolm remembered sitting in that office, the walls lined with framed publications, while Ellison spoke in a measured, almost gentle tone, a tone that made rejection sound like mentorship, that made exclusion feel like professionalism. The cruelty, Malcolm explained, had never been loud. It was controlled, intellectual, and difficult to accuse because it wore the language of refinement. Elijah's moment wasn't an accident, Malcolm said quietly. It was a pattern finally caught on camera. The room fell silent. Elijah lowered his gaze, not out of sadness but because he suddenly understood that what had happened to him belonged to a much larger story. He was not the first to stand in front of Ellison's judgment. He was the first who could not be erased. Vanessa exhaled slowly, feeling both sorrow and clarity press against her ribs. Within hours of Rachel's testimony, others began stepping forward. Former Black and Latino students, some still anonymous, some finally ready to attach their names, shared screenshots, archived emails and passages from critique summaries that echoed the same chilling vocabulary. One student described how Ellison had called her installation honoring displaced Caribbean communities, emotionally indulgent, advising her to avoid leaning on identity as artistic crutch. Another recounted how his scholarship application mysteriously lost committee support after Ellison described his portfolio as politically charged rather than intellectually expansive. They were not isolated incidents. They were strands of a web woven quietly, almost elegantly beneath institutional respectability. The narrative shifted again. News outlets no longer framed the story as a viral moment or a trending debate. Instead, they began to call it a case study in elite academic bias. Panels of cultural critics dissected the power imbalance inherent in critique, how the art world's gatekeepers shaped whose narratives were allowed to exist. Some spoke in controlled tones about pedagogy and standards, while others spoke in voices edged with grief, recalling projects they had abandoned after similar humiliations, dreams they had scaled down to survive. For the first time, Harvard felt visible in a way it did not control. Inside the administration's offices, emails moved rapidly under subject lines like reputational risk and incident response strategy. A crisis meeting unfolded behind closed doors, not to examine harm, but to assess optics. Phrases such as public reassurance, institutional commitment, and community dialogue framework circulated, words constructed to sound like accountability, while carefully avoiding it. Ellison, though placed on an unofficial internal review, remained protected by faculty tenure and institutional insulation. The quiet disdain that had shaped so many careers was now reshaped as a procedural matter. Meanwhile, Elijah watched every development from the same couch where he had once held the topper in silence. This time, however, the silence felt different, heavier, more complex. He scrolled through confession threads, and with each story, he felt a strange mix of connection and unease. These people shared his pain, yet each confession made it clearer that his humiliation had not been about failure or taste. It had been a continuation of something older than him. He whispered to Vanessa, almost as if afraid to let the words exist aloud. "He's been doing this my whole life, even before I was old enough to be mocked." Vanessa rested her hand on his shoulder. Her expression did not harden with anger. It deepened with resolve. Rachel Linwood reached out directly the following evening. Her call was not framed like a press inquiry or collaborative appeal. It sounded like two survivors speaking across a decade of shared dismissal. Her voice carried warmth, sorrow, and a resilience sharpened by years spent rebuilding what Ellison had once crushed. "I don't want to speak for him," Rachel said, her tone careful, "but I want to stand beside him. Not as a symbol, as an artist whose work deserved respect the first time he created it." Her support surprised Elijah. It did not feel like validation from prestige. It felt like inheritance, a passing of narrative from one silenced creator to another. She told him that when her thesis had been rejected, she almost abandoned fine art entirely. Years later, she realized that the dismissal had not been about artistic inadequacy. It had been about who institutions believed had the right to define art. "That's why this hurts them," she said softly. "Because you made something powerful without their permission." The tension deepened when Harvard finally released an official statement. The words appeared across social feeds in a simple white graphic embossed with the university crest. The opening sentence emphasized mutual respect, followed by a pledge to review departmental practices and listen to concerns with openness. There was no acknowledgement of racial disparity, no apology, no mention of Elijah by name, just language polished to appear thoughtful while remaining distant. It sounded like closure without consequence. The response struck Vanessa not as relief, but as confirmation. Confirmation that institutions had learned how to appear reflective while leaving the wound intact. She read the statement twice, then set the phone down quietly. Her silence was not passive. It was the stillness before action. That evening she sat at the kitchen table. The original folder of Malcolm's documents spread beside new attachments people had sent. She did not approach them as outrage fodder or viral ammunition. She approached them like evidence, not just against a professor but against a system that had rehearsed erasure until it looked like professional critique. Her expression sharpened with intention. "Eli," she said gently, "this is bigger than emails or apologies. They're going to try to turn this into an internal issue, something handled in private rooms." He looked up, uncertain. "So what do we do?" The answer did not come with bravado. It came with quiet certainty. "We take this out of their rooms," she said. "We take it somewhere they don't control." The unexpected twist was not anger. It was strategy. Vanessa did not want a headline. She wanted a hearing. By the time Harvard's statement began circulating widely, she had already begun contacting a civil rights legal advocacy group and a coalition of student activists across multiple universities. She requested something unprecedented, an open public tribunal on institutional bias in academic critique, centered not around apology, but testimony. She was not waiting for Harvard to respond. She was preparing to confront them. Harvard released a statement, but Elijah's mother had already planned her next move. By the time Harvard's carefully worded statement circulated across feeds and news tickers, Vanessa Carter already understood what it was designed to do. It wasn't meant to address harm. It was meant to control pace, to slow outrage into discussion, to drag urgency into process. It sounded reflective, but it was empty, and the hollowness of its language settled inside her like a cold weight she refused to carry any longer. She had spent years moving quietly through systems that demanded patience from people who lived with wounds they did not cause. This moment, this story built from humiliation, grief, and resilience, would not be absorbed into institutional silence. The morning she decided to step forward, she did not wake up feeling brave. She woke up feeling steady. Elijah watched her from the living room, as she layered her coat over a simple black sweater, her movements slow but certain. A small group of student organizers had helped arrange a gathering outside Harvard's wrought iron gates. Not a rally for noise, but a space for testimony. Vanessa had never spoken into a microphone in her life, and yet the moment felt strangely familiar, like something had been waiting inside her for years, and had finally found a doorway. By the time she arrived, cameras lined the perimeter like sentinels. Reporters shifted their weight from foot to foot in the winter cold. Students wrapped scarves around their faces, and handwritten signs bobbed above the crowd. Phrases like "bias is not pedagogy," and "art belongs to all of us," etched in thick marker. The air carried that strange mix of electricity and restraint that precedes history, and at the center stood Vanessa, hands trembling slightly, as she accepted the microphone. She did not begin with anger. She began with memory. "My son made something with his hands," she said, her voice steady but layered with grief, "because he was trying to hold on to the father he lost. And when a man with power looked at it, he didn't see a child's heart. He saw something he believed did not belong in his definition of excellence." The crowd quieted into stillness. The wind moved across the gates, rattling the bars like breath. "This isn't about art," she continued, each word measured, unafraid. "This is about who gets to decide what brilliance looks like, and who is told that their voice, their history, their grief, their imagination, is unworthy before it's even understood." The sentence expanded across the courtyard like a slow reverberating echo. Students did not cheer. They leaned forward. Behind the gates, administrators watched from office windows, monitoring tone rather than truth. Their concerns were logistical: optics, liability, escalation. But what began that day did not behave like a press event. It unfolded like testimony, honored in public light. One by one, students stepped forward, some trembling, some firm, sharing small fragments of their own encounters, critiques that cut deeper than intended, biases disguised as intellectual rigor, dreams reshaped into something quieter just to pass. Elijah stood slightly behind the cameras, listening. He didn't see himself as the reason people were there. He saw himself woven among them, another thread in a story too large to belong to one person. Vanessa then spoke the words that altered the course of the scandal entirely. "I am asking," she said, with a controlled breath, "for an open tribunal. Not a panel, not a private review. A public documented tribunal, where students, alumni, and faculty can testify about institutional bias and critique culture. On record, without fear of retaliation. The word tribunal landed like a strike. This was no longer a call for apology. It was a demand for accountability. In daylight, cameras snapped. Reporters leaned in. The story shifted again. Across campuses nationwide, Vanessa's speech spread like a spark through dry fields. Students formed circles, organizing sit-ins and walkouts. Not in loud eruptions but in disciplined, deliberate movements. They gathered in libraries and courtyards, reading aloud excerpts from rejected theses and critique reports that echoed the same coded language Malcolm had shown Vanessa at her kitchen table. Art programs from state schools to private academies announced solidarity teach-outs, reframing critique culture as a question of power rather than taste. Meanwhile, inside Harvard's administrative offices, meeting doors shut with a soft but anxious finality, board members analyzed the narrative from behind polished conference tables, their conversations circling liability and precedent. A public tribunal could expose internal processes, one warned. We need to redirect this into review committees. Another advised caution, emphasizing measured response and protecting institutional dignity. Dignity. The word echoed like irony. Dr. Grant Ellison sat in a separate boardroom across campus, jaw tight, posture rigid. His attorney spoke more than he did, insisting that the incident had been taken out of context, that pedagogical critique was being misrepresented as discrimination. Ellison's silence, however, carried arrogance rather than humility. He saw himself as a scholar under siege by a public that did not understand academic rigor. More unsettling still, he refused to step down. When one administrator suggested voluntary leave pending investigation, Ellison responded coldly. Resignation implies wrongdoing. I have committed none. The phrase, spoken with measured precision, carried the weight of someone accustomed to systems bending before him. Then came the escalation. Through counsel, he threatened legal action if the university took disciplinary steps that he believed compromised his reputation. The institution faltered, not morally, but procedurally. Outside those walls, the world's attention intensified. Major networks aired segments dissecting critique bias, cultural erasure in elite academia, and the ethics of power in creative disciplines. Panels debated whether art could ever be evaluated outside the lens of identity, and whether pretending to do so was itself a strategy of exclusion. Elijah's topper remained in frame, no longer mocked, now studied as symbol and catalyst. Yet through the noise, the cost remained deeply human. At home, Elijah sat with Vanessa late one evening, the city glowing faintly outside their window. He confessed, in a low voice, I didn't mean for all this to happen. She turned to him slowly, the tenderness in her voice grounding them both. You didn't cause this, she said. You revealed it. He swallowed, absorbing the difference. Her determination did not harden into rage. It simmered into purpose. The more Harvard avoided direct accountability, the more the narrative expanded beyond them. Letters from civil rights organizations arrived in Vanessa's inbox, offering legal counsel and structural support to build the tribunal she envisioned. What had begun as a mother protecting her son evolved into a movement demanding a seat at a table long controlled by voices claiming objectivity while selectively dismissing identity. And then, just as momentum steadied into form, something fractured the silence behind the university's walls. Late one evening, a student journalist received an anonymous drive slipped into the student newspaper's Dropbox. Inside were screenshots of an internal faculty email chain, dozens of messages exchanged over several years among members of the art department. Some were smug, some were cruel, some revealed biases so subdued and coded they could easily masquerade as professional critique, until placed side by side. One line in particular pierced like a blade. Students from urban-oriented backgrounds tend to rely too heavily on sentimentality. We must ensure emotion does not substitute for intellect. Another read, encouraging their projects too much risks lowering departmental standards. Best to redirect them into more practical fields. The most damning message, however, came from Ellison himself. An email forwarded with an attached image of Elijah's topper, and a caption meant to amuse colleagues. A charming example of enthusiasm exceeding discipline, he wrote. At least it gave us a laugh. The drive made its way from the newsroom to social feeds, and then to national headlines within hours. The scandal was no longer accusation. It was evident. The storm, once theoretical, had become undeniable. A secret faculty email chain was leaked, And it was damning. The emails did not explode into the world with noise. They spread with the quiet precision of something that had been buried for years, and was finally breathing. Screens lit up in dorm rooms, subway cars, offices, and kitchens across the country, as people scrolled down thread after thread of faculty exchanges that stripped away the polished language Harvard used in public. The tone of the messages was not overtly violent, not crude or uncontrolled. Instead, it was worse. It was composed. It was intellectual. It was confident in its superiority, and that confidence revealed how deeply the bias had been woven into the department's cultural backbone. As the public read line after line, the mask began to fall from the institution's reputation. One professor wrote, "Urban students need clear guidance, otherwise they lean into sentiment instead of academic rigor. They must learn their place in a discipline built on discipline." The phrase "learn their place" lingered on every screen, like a bruise. In another email, a colleague lamented too much praise for mediocrity, a sentence surrounded by complaints about community-based projects being politically burdened and emotionally manipulative. These weren't slips of language. They were philosophies spoken comfortably in a space that believed itself immune to consequence. The irony was unmistakable. The same faculty who claimed objectivity used coded language that revealed exactly how subjective their standards had always been. And then came the message that cut through all debate. It was Ellison's. He had forwarded an image of Elijah's topper months before the scandal, attaching it with the casual cruelty of someone who had done this many times without being challenged. The caption beneath the photo read, "A charming example of enthusiasm exceeding discipline. Consider this your midweek laugh break." Several colleagues responded with small approving remarks, some with academic jargon masking ridicule, others with subtle amusement. On its own, it might have looked dismissive. In context, it became an artifact of elitism practiced privately and denied publicly. The ornament that symbolized Elijah's grief, memory, and boundless curiosity had been reduced to entertainment for those who held the power to define excellence. The reaction was immediate. Sponsors pulled funding within hours, issuing statements that expressed concern regarding institutional climate. Donors paused endowments, shifting tone from loyalty to distance. Departments unrelated to Ellison scrambled to issue disclaimers, emphasizing independence, while student organizations flooded campus lawns with printed excerpts from the leaked chain, taping them onto brick walls where silence could no longer hide them. Black alumni wrote a collective letter demanding reparative measures and systemic overhaul, not in vague language, but with unmistakable clarity, resignations, structural review, and public accountability. What stunned the administration most was not the outrage. It was the specificity of the anger. People were no longer reacting to a viral video or a single incident. They were responding to a documented ecosystem of bias, one that didn't shout or threaten but instead erased, minimized, and belittled brilliance until it bent or disappeared. For years, students had internalized that dismissal as personal inadequacy. Now they saw the machinery behind it. Harvard's board entered crisis mode. Inside a high-ceilinged conference room, they studied charts of withdrawn funding and projected losses, but beneath the financial panic lived a deeper fear, reputational fracture. For institutions built on prestige, perception was infrastructure. If the world believed their evaluation systems rewarded whiteness disguised as intellect, then the foundation of their credibility trembled. Containment is no longer viable, one board member admitted, his voice thin. This is structural in appearance, and increasingly structural in reality. Another finally said the words they had avoided. This isn't just a PR problem, it's an ethical one. Yet even then, the discussion drifted toward litigation, policy language, strategic apologies, everything but the core wound. While leadership tried to salvage control, the world beyond their walls shifted into a moral chorus. Cable anchors read aloud excerpts from the emails on live broadcasts, their voices alternating between shock and grim recognition. Cultural critics explained how elitism and racism fed each other, not through slurs or open hostility but through dismissal, exclusion, and the constant suggestion that non-white expression needed translation to be valid. Students watching from home saw their private humiliations echoed in sentences written by people who once told them they simply weren't ready. Back in Dorchester, Elijah sat at the table with Vanessa, the laptop screen glowing between them, illuminating their faces in a harsh, white light. He read Ellison's laugh break message silently, his lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't anger that filled him. It was the realization that he had been mocked long before anyone pretended to critique him. His art had never stood a chance under their gaze. The laughter had existed in small, shared circles before it ever reached him. Vanessa watched his expression shift. Without raising her voice, she whispered, "They were joking about you before they even stood in front of you." Elijah exhaled slowly. "They weren't joking," he replied. "They were practicing." That sentence lingered in the room like a truth too sharp to soften. The leaked chain became evidence not of impulse but of culture. Faculty scrambled to issue individual statements, some apologetic, some defensive, some cloaked in academic language. A few acknowledged harm honestly, but most appealed to context, invoking intellectual freedom as shield. Yet the public no longer accepted the performance of nuance. The power imbalance was visible. The harm was documented. And still, Ellison did not resign. His attorney released a statement claiming the emails had been selectively interpreted, arguing that robust critique is essential to academic excellence. But the world had seen enough. People were no longer arguing philosophy. They were tracing the trajectory of exclusion embedded in evaluative language. Black alumni gathered for an emergency virtual forum, late into the night. Their faces filled the screen, some gray-haired, some only a few years beyond graduation. And one after another they spoke about years spent shrinking their voices to avoid ridicule, disguised as wisdom. A former student described sitting in Ellison's office while he suggested she develop a less identity-dependent practice if she wanted to progress. Another said he spent his entire degree reshaping his work into something hollow, something he no longer recognized. None of them sounded surprised by the emails. They sounded proven. The weight of that validation felt both liberating and devastating. Liberating because the truth was no longer buried. Devastating because it confirmed how many dreams had been quietly corrected away from themselves. Meanwhile, student protests intensified, but they were not chaotic. They were organized, intentional, almost reverent in form. Instead of chants, students read excerpts aloud in unison, a haunting chorus of institutional phrases now stripped of their disguise. "We encourage you to avoid emotional dependence. Remain academically neutral. Consider refocusing away from cultural specificity." In repetition, the harm became undeniable. The language sounded less like guidance and more like erasure. The board faced an ultimatum delivered by donors, alumni coalitions, and student bodies: initiate an external investigation and restructure the department, or face a nationwide boycott of affiliated programs. Harvard had reached a threshold where silence no longer protected it. Yet, in the midst of public reckoning, an unexpected voice stepped forward, one the world had not yet heard. A young black freshman, barely months into her first semester, requested to speak at a student forum. She appeared small in the frame at first, shoulders drawn inward, eyes hesitant, but when she began to speak, the room, both physical and virtual, fell into a stunned stillness. Her story did not describe an incident years past. It described something that had happened only weeks earlier. She had been discouraged from submitting a project to the same professor, not because it lacked depth, but because he suggested it might be too culturally autobiographical to withstand serious critique. His words had been measured, gentle, academically phrased, but beneath them, she had felt the same message every voice in that email chain carried. Her experience wasn't history. It was present, and with that revelation, the scandal was no longer about past harm resurfacing. It was about a wound still alive inside the institution, still shaping futures, still altering voices, still shrinking possibility, in real time. The room held its breath. Her story didn't merely confirm the bias, it shattered whatever illusion remained that this was an old pattern finally exposed. It was happening, right now. A young black freshman at Harvard came forward, and her story shattered everything. She looked so small behind the podium. Her frame nearly disappeared in the oversized Harvard sweatshirt she wore, sleeves pulled down over her hands as if she could shrink further into them. But when Chantel Wright raised her head, the auditorium held its breath. The hush wasn't ceremonial. It was charged. This wasn't a planned speech. It wasn't part of a protest schedule or student meeting. It was something raw, unexpected, and electric, sparked by the eruption of the leaked emails and pushed into the open by the weight of 100 quiet humiliations. Chantel was a freshman, barely 4 months into her time at Harvard. She hadn't come to start a movement. She came with sketchbooks, with dreams wrapped in the kind of cautious pride that black families carry like fragile heirlooms when one of their own gets into an ivy. Her voice, when it came, was soft but piercing, not because of volume, but because of precision. "I was told," she began, "that my concept was too culturally loaded, too emotional, and eventually, too ghetto." The word landed with a silence louder than any chant. No one spoke. No one shifted. And in that stillness, Chantel opened her email on the screen behind her. The projection glowed. Words not imagined but archived. The email was from Professor Grant Ellison. While his tone remained professional, the implication bled through. Her proposal for a mixed media installation, combining hair braiding patterns, African textile symbolism, and ancestral storytelling through light and shadow was described as socially ambitious, but aesthetically provincial. He wrote, "Your piece leans heavily into cultural familiarity, but lacks intellectual detachment, making it emotionally charged to the point of theatricality. The academic language couldn't mask the message. Your art is too black to be taken seriously." Then Chantel played a voicemail, her thumb hovering just a moment before pressing play. The room held still as Ellison's voice filled the air. Calm, precise, confident. "I just think, moving forward, if you want to be taken seriously by galleries and juries, you'll need to move past identity-centric narratives. They don't age well in critical spaces. Trust me on this." It wasn't overt hate. It was quiet correction disguised as mentorship. The kind that doesn't just reject, but reshapes. The kind that takes a young artist's voice and folds it into something safer, paler, emptier. Chantel stood straighter now, her voice cracking but rising. "I went back to my dorm that night and tore the whole thing apart. I stayed up all night trying to make it intellectually neutral. I thought maybe it was me. Maybe I was the one who didn't get it. But when I saw those emails, when I saw they laughed at Elijah's piece before they even met him, I realized it was never about the work. It was about making sure we didn't believe ours could ever be enough." Murmurs moved through the crowd like wind, some students shaking their heads, others staring down, realizing their own silent edits were part of the same machine. But it was what Chantel said next that hollowed the room. "My advisor told me not to come here today. She said speaking out could impact my academic trajectory. She said, if I wanted a future in art, I needed to be strategic, not emotional. She told me, silence now means opportunity later." She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't crumble. She stood with the stillness of someone whose truth had finally outgrown her fear. And when she stepped down, the crowd didn't erupt. It rose, all at once, to its feet. Not for drama, not for rebellion, for clarity. Because no institutional review, no statement, no boardroom spin could flatten what had just happened. Her confession sliced deeper than all the evidence. Because it wasn't history. It was unfolding. It wasn't legacy. It was lived. That night, the video of Chantel's testimony shattered the internet's noise cycle. It wasn't edited with flashy cuts or set to music. It didn't need to be. Her words moved like scripture, quoted, reposted, translated, and archived within hours. Teachers played it in classrooms. Artists added her quotes to gallery walls. Civil rights lawyers cited her in press briefings. Her voice became more than a reaction. It became a reckoning, and it left Harvard nowhere to hide. Vanessa watched it unfold from her kitchen, one hand over her mouth, the other curled around a coffee mug gone cold. Elijah stood beside her, arms crossed, lips pressed together. It wasn't just that someone else had suffered under the same voice that tried to belittle him. It was that she'd been told to shrink herself in the exact same way, that made the damage systemic, personal, and still operational. Vanessa whispered, almost to herself. They told her to trade truth for a future. Elijah didn't blink. But her truth is the future. Later that afternoon, while still scrolling through the ripple effect of Chantel's confession, Elijah noticed a square envelope in the mail pile by the door. It was heavy, with gold-trimmed edges and an embossed crest in deep crimson, the Harvard seal. His fingers paused over it. He didn't rip it open. He held it the way you hold something dangerous disguised as prestige. Vanessa raised an eyebrow from the couch. "What is that?" Elijah turned the envelope over, inspecting the back. "I don't know. It's addressed to me. No return name. Just Harvard." He didn't move, didn't open it, because whatever was inside could be invitation or manipulation, a gesture of repair or a calculated deflection. And in a moment where truth was rising louder than power, trust had become the rarest currency. But eventually he slipped a finger under the flap and peeled it open. Inside wasn't a standard letter or a typed statement. It was handwritten, short, precise, and what it said next would turn the entire scandal on its head. Elijah received a letter, embossed with the Harvard seal. Elijah read the letter 3 times, but the words never changed. The envelope had arrived without warning, And inside, written in immaculate penmanship on university-embossed stationery, was an invitation, not an apology, not an explanation, but a perfectly tailored offer. Harvard was extending a fully funded spot to Elijah Carter in their prestigious Summer Youth Fellowship, an elite 6-week academic residency on campus, designed to nurture promising talent from underserved communities. There was no mention of Dr. Ellison, no reference to the emails, not even a vague nod to the scandal unraveling across every news outlet. Just polished language that made it sound like Harvard had always been watching Elijah, like they had seen his brilliance long before the world did. The message dripped with strategy. Extend a hand before the house burns down. Elijah handed the letter to Vanessa, his face unreadable. She took it, eyes narrowing as she scanned the paragraphs, her mind already moving 2 steps ahead. The wording was precise, too precise. It was the kind of institutional speak that sounded generous while avoiding accountability. Promising candidate, potential contributor to academic dialogue, an emerging creative voice. They had studied him now, not as a child grieving through creation, but as a reputation waiting to be leveraged. Vanessa set the letter down on the kitchen table, without saying a word. The silence was longer than Elijah expected. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, but weighted. This is calculated. He nodded. Feels like they're trying to buy peace. They're not offering you space, she said. They're offering themselves cover. The media, however, had already begun spinning it. Word of the offer leaked within hours. Headlines painted the development as a silver lining, a redemption arc. Harvard extends olive branch to teen artist. From mockery to mentorship, Elijah Carter's full circle moment. Analysts discussed it on morning shows like it was a clean victory, a gesture of progress. But no one asked Elijah how he felt. No one questioned why the same institution whose faculty mocked him now wanted to parade his potential. Even more telling, Harvard hadn't invited him to speak. They hadn't asked to meet. They hadn't issued a formal public apology. They had merely shifted the optics from silence to scholarship. And beneath the headlines, the rot remained untouched. Dr. Grant Ellison had been placed on leave, but it was administrative, and with full pay. The announcement was made quietly, buried in a faculty memo that leaked online only after students demanded answers. It did not use the word suspension. It did not acknowledge wrongdoing. It simply stated that Dr. Ellison would be taking time away from his professional duties to allow for review of recent events. Review, not investigation, not accountability. Activist groups responded immediately, staging a second wave of walkouts. Paid leave is a vacation, one student declared into a megaphone outside Harvard Yard. It's not justice, it's protection. Vanessa watched the media spin from her phone, growing more furious with every passing hour. Elijah, meanwhile, withdrew further into himself. The attention, once energizing, once validating, now felt like a trap. Everyone wanted something from him. Validation, proof, symbolism. But no one wanted to carry what he had been forced to feel the night a man in a suit laughed at his grief. One evening, while they ate dinner, Vanessa finally asked him the question they had both been avoiding. "Do you want to go?" Elijah put his fork down and stared at the plate. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's Harvard." "But it's not honest," she countered. "And you don't owe them your trust because they suddenly want to look generous." He was quiet for a long time. I want to be in spaces where people don't think I'm lucky to be there." She reached across the table and touched his hand gently. "Then you go where you're respected, not where you were tolerated." The conversation ended there, but the decision lingered like smoke. That night Elijah went to bed earlier than usual. His sketchbook sat untouched on the dresser. The topper, which usually sat perched on the living room shelf beside the window, gleamed faintly under the soft lamplight. It had become more than an ornament now. It was part of their home, their history, a symbol no longer mocked but marveled at. And then came the unexpected turn. Sometime between midnight and dawn, while the city slept under a thin layer of frost, someone broke in. There was no shattered glass, no loud crash, just the faint creak of a back window, pried open with deliberate care. Whoever entered didn't rummage. They didn't steal electronics or wallets. They didn't even touch Elijah's sketchbook or the protest letters scattered on the kitchen counter. They took one thing, the tree topper. It was gone by the time Elijah woke up. He noticed immediately. The shelf stood empty, a perfect square of dust outlining where the base had rested. Panic surged through him, but it wasn't about the object itself. It was about everything it represented. His father, his voice, the pain he turned into structure. Someone had stolen that. Not for money, Not for destruction. For silence. Vanessa searched the apartment for signs of forced entry. There were none. The lock on the window was tampered with, but not broken. Nothing else was disturbed. It was surgical. Intentional. She called the police, but the report felt hollow. They promised to investigate, but neither of them believed it would lead anywhere. The moment news of the theft reached social media, speculation exploded. Some blamed Harvard, claiming the institution wanted to control the narrative. Others pointed fingers at private collectors or academic saboteurs. The truth was unclear, but the message was unmistakable. Someone had moved to erase the heart of this story. It wasn't just theft, it was erasure in real time. Vanessa stood by the empty shelf for hours, staring at the absence, as if by sheer focus she could summon it back. Elijah sat on the floor nearby, his knees pulled to his chest. "They don't want me," he murmured. "They want the symbol." Vanessa's eyes glistened, but her voice remained strong. "Then we build something they can't steal." But deep down she knew this was no longer just about recognition. It was about ownership. The topper disappeared from their home, stolen in the middle of the night. The apartment felt colder the morning after the break-in. It wasn't the winter air slipping through the window, now sealed again with cheap hardware and a chair propped beneath the frame. It was the absence. The space where the topper once sat, quietly, proudly, defiantly, was now a hollow echo. Dust outlined its silhouette, as if memory itself had been scraped clean. Elijah stood in front of it, unmoving, unable to look away. It wasn't just about the art anymore. It was about the silence that followed. Someone had come in the night and taken his voice. Not the one in his throat, but the one he had built with wire, glass, light and grief. Vanessa called the police, filed the report, and answered the questions with a tone that flickered between composed and trembling. "Yes, nothing else was taken. No, we have no suspects. No, we didn't have an alarm system." But when the officer suggested it might be a random burglary, her tone snapped clean. "A thief breaks in and walks past electronics, cash, jewelry, and steals a piece of art made from hangers and scrap. Come on." Elijah didn't speak. His silence wasn't shock. It was weight. His expression had settled into something unreadable, a tightness around the eyes, like a storm waiting behind glass. Later that day, Vanessa checked the building's hallway cameras. She had forgotten that the landlord had installed them after a noise complaint the previous year. It was grainy, but enough to see movement. A figure masked, gloved, dressed in black, moved down the hallway at 3:17 a.m. They didn't linger. They didn't fumble. They knew exactly where to go. Less than 4 minutes later, they were gone. Elijah leaned over her shoulder watching the footage. "They weren't looking for anything," he muttered. "They came for it." Online, the story ignited like wildfire. The theft of the topper added a new layer of urgency, one that shifted the tone from public scandal to something darker. Conspiracy, cover-up, sabotage, speculation flooded social media. Was Harvard involved? Had someone tried to destroy the symbol before it became untouchable? Had a collector stolen it to control its narrative? The questions buzzed louder than the answers. Meanwhile, Harvard issued no statement. No concern. Not even a gesture. Then came the knock. It was quiet, deliberate. A man in his 60s stood at their door, tall, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much and lips that rarely wasted words. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a retired homicide detective who had spent decades with Boston PD, before walking away from a department that he claimed got too good at forgetting black families. "I saw the story on the news," he said, glancing at Elijah. "And when I heard the topper was stolen, I didn't just see a crime, I saw a message." Vanessa's instinct flared. "What do you want from us?" Daniel didn't blink. "To help you find what they don't want you to have back." She studied him for a long second. Elijah gave a subtle nod. Daniel got to work that same afternoon. He reviewed the footage frame by frame, tracking the figure's path through the hallway and narrowing down the angle of entry. Then he asked the question no one else had bothered to ask. Who knew where the topper was kept? Vanessa hesitated. "Everyone who's been in this apartment, I guess. We didn't hide it." "Not who's been in here," he clarified. "Who had something to gain from it? Not being here."
That was the pivot.
Because the topper wasn't just art anymore. It had become evidence. A visual, emotional, physical manifestation of everything the institution had tried to diminish. Its presence fueled protests. Its image funded lawsuits. Its story reminded people what silence looked like when it wore a suit. And now it was missing. Not sold, not destroyed, but stolen. Daniel traced the footage back to a side alley camera, maintained by a neighboring dry cleaner. The footage was clearer. The thief hadn't parked. They had been dropped off. A black SUV. No plates visible. Pulled in for just 90 seconds. The driver never got out. The figure emerged, entered, returned, and was gone. This wasn't a junkie, Daniel said. This was a job. He made a call to a contact in building security at Harvard. It was a long shot, but Daniel had chased longer odds. By the next evening, the contact called back. What he said cracked the story open. Check the private offices in Dunbridge Hall. The contact whispered. One of the trustees. He's got something stashed. Daniel didn't ask how he knew. He just drove to the campus, brought Vanessa and Elijah with him, and waited in the car across from the admin building, watching the lights go out one by one, as offices emptied for the night. When the last administrator left, Daniel slipped around the side and used a staff badge his contact had borrowed. Elijah stayed in the car, heart hammering in his chest. 10 minutes later, Daniel emerged with a photo on his phone. He handed it to Vanessa. It was blurry but unmistakable. Elijah's tree topper, sitting on a marble shelf in the corner of a private office. The desk plaque beneath it read, Martin Creed, Board of Trustees. Vanessa's breath caught. Why would a trustee take it? Daniel's jaw tightened. Because symbols are dangerous, and whoever controls the symbol, controls the story. That night, Elijah stared at the photo in silence. Not out of disbelief, out of confirmation. Somewhere deep inside, he had known this wasn't random. This wasn't some street-level crime. This was about containment. Someone had tried to steal, not just his work but the meaning behind it. And now, it sat hidden behind polished glass, in the office of a man who had never once acknowledged the boy who created it. Vanessa pressed her palm to the screen. We're not letting this go quiet. Daniel agreed. But if you want it back, don't just demand it. Make them fear the noise. The next morning, Elijah posted the photo online. No caption, no filter, just the image of the topper, gleaming beneath Harvard's crest, inside the office of a man who had never spoken his name. The image did more than go viral. It detonated. The topper was found in the office of a Harvard trustee. The photo of Elijah's tree topper, sitting on a shelf in the office of Harvard trustee Martin Creed, detonated across the internet like a live wire dropped in water. Within hours it was splashed across timelines, newscasts, and the front pages of digital publications. Comment sections didn't just rage, they surged with disbelief and fury. The same institution that had let its professor belittle Elijah publicly had quietly confiscated the very object that sparked a national reckoning and displayed it like a trophy. Not in a gallery, not in a museum, but in private, like it belonged to them. Martin Creed, a longtime donor and member of the Harvard Board of Trustees, didn't make a public statement immediately. Instead, Harvard's communications office released a short, vague note. The tree topper created by Elijah Carter was retrieved by Trustee Creed, under the impression that it was at risk and needed secure preservation. There was no intention to conceal or claim ownership. The language was corporate, calculated, and unconvincing. Vanessa read the statement aloud to Elijah, who sat stiff on the edge of the couch, his jaw clenched. Retrieved? She repeated. Like they picked up a lost puppy? Elijah didn't respond. His silence had hardened now, no longer the stillness of shock, but of betrayal sharpened by experience. Daniel Brooks, the retired detective, wasn't satisfied either. He returned to Creed's office the next morning, not as a trespasser, but as a man armed with legal leverage and a quiet threat to go public with surveillance angles. Harvard hadn't accounted for. What he found during that follow-up shook the narrative further. Creed, perhaps thinking no one would ever connect the dots, had left a folder on his desk. Inside were drafts of a proposed event titled Reclaiming Vision, Youth Art, and Resilience in Urban America. The exhibition was to be hosted at Harvard's Faculty of Arts, timed precisely for the anniversary of the Ellison scandal, and would feature Elijah's topper as the centerpiece. Nowhere in the drafts was Elijah's name. Nowhere. There were references to community expression, to healing symbols, and to unorthodox brilliance emerging from hardship. But the artist himself had been completely removed. The topper was being curated into a narrative, Harvard's narrative, not as a symbol of protest, but as a symbol of their inclusion efforts. Daniel photographed every page. When Vanessa saw the folder, her hands trembled. They were going to rewrite him out of his own story. Elijah looked at the screen in disbelief, then at Daniel. And they were going to smile about it. Daniel nodded. You weren't part of the solution. You were the proof that they needed one. That night, Vanessa drafted a single post, attaching the photos of the exhibition draft, with a caption that sliced like a scalpel. This is what erasure looks like. Polished, framed, and retold without the artist. Harvard, you don't get to rebrand the pain you caused. The post went viral within minutes. Harvard erased me began trending before midnight. This time, the response was different. Louder, sharper. Artists, authors, students, and celebrities spoke out, not just about injustice, but about how institutions manipulate legacy. One filmmaker tweeted, "They didn't just steal his work, they tried to control the meaning of it. This is historical violence in real time." Harvard scrambled again. Another statement followed, this one less vague, now calling it a miscommunication between departments, and assuring the public that Elijah would be fully credited and welcomed into the exhibition planning process. But it was too late. The damage wasn't just the theft, it was the arrogance behind it. People weren't angry because Harvard displayed the topper. They were enraged because they tried to own the very thing they once dismissed as trash. Elijah refused the offer flatly. No public negotiations, no polite decline, just a simple, recorded message posted on his social channels. "I didn't make the topper so it could sit behind glass for people who laughed at it. I made it because I was grieving. You don't get to use my father, my pain, or my voice to fix your image. I'm not your exhibit." That clip alone was viewed 17 million times in less than 2 days. What followed was a wave of renewed support. Protesters returned to the Harvard gates, not in defiance this time, but in defense of Elijah, of ownership, of the right to define one's own story. Artists began recreating versions of the topper in cities across the country, each with slight variations, different wings, different lights, different symbols. They called them legacy stars, and they weren't tributes to Harvard. They were tributes to resilience that institutions tried to erase. It was in the middle of this surge that an unexpected email arrived in Vanessa's inbox. Not from a journalist, not from a university, from a museum. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The message was short, direct, and unlike the others. It wasn't wrapped in PR. It didn't ask for Elijah to become a brand. It asked if he would consider curating a solo exhibit, not just to display the topper, but to build a space around his process, his voice, his journey. The letter made one thing clear. This would be his story, on his terms. Vanessa read the message aloud. Elijah sat across from her, stunned. The Smithsonian, the most prestigious Black cultural institution in the country. They didn't want to repackage him. They wanted to honor him. But the final line of the letter gave him pause. "We ask only one thing, that this story is no longer centered around Harvard, but around your art." Elijah swallowed hard. It wasn't a catch. It wasn't manipulation. It was a challenge to reclaim the narrative entirely, to step outside the shadow of trauma and into the spotlight of creative autonomy. Vanessa leaned forward, sensing his hesitation. "You've carried their shame long enough, baby. Maybe it's time you let your story stand alone." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked at the empty space on the shelf where the topper once sat. Then he glanced down at the sketchbook on his lap, the one he hadn't opened in weeks. He flipped it open and began to draw again. A major museum offered Elijah a solo exhibit, on one condition. The offer was generous, historic even, but it came with a line that carried weight beyond formality. To move forward with the Smithsonian exhibit, Elijah would need to publicly decline Harvard's summer program. Not quietly, not through a private email, but on record, on camera, without compromise. It wasn't about vendetta. It was about clarity. The museum was building an exhibit around reclamation, not revisionism. They weren't interested in coexisting with the institution that had first humiliated and then tried to appropriate Elijah's work. To curate history, they needed truth, uninterrupted, unapologetic, and untethered from prestige. Elijah didn't hesitate. He sat in his bedroom, lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp, as Vanessa stood behind the phone camera. There were no production crews, no rehearsed statements, no consultants, just Elijah, his voice, and the burden he was ready to drop. "I'm not going to Harvard's summer program," he began, his tone quiet but certain. "Not because I'm not grateful, but because I'm not for sale. They didn't believe in me when it mattered. They laughed at my grief and dismissed my work before they understood it. And then when the world started listening, they wanted to use me to repair their image. But I'm not a brand. I'm not a press release. I'm a kid who made something honest, and I won't let the same place that erased me pretend they made me." The video, once posted, traveled across the internet like a pulse. It wasn't fiery. It wasn't loud. but it was unshakable. Within hours, major news outlets had clipped it, reposted it, and recontextualized the scandal again. Elijah Carter, once a symbol of shame turned into resistance, had now become a voice of principled refusal, not bitter, but boundaried, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. The Smithsonian responded with a launch date. Stars from the Scrap would open in 3 months, featuring not just Elijah's recreated topper, but a full collection of his conceptual models, sketches, and symbolic sculptures. It would be housed in the museum's Contemporary Black Voices Gallery, surrounded by the works of established legends, and curated entirely under Elijah's name. For the first time, he wasn't being framed by pain, he was being framed by vision. Elijah worked with curators day and night. He rebuilt the topper from memory and feeling, refusing to make it identical. This version had differences: heavier wings, slightly uneven coils, and a brighter pulsing light at its center. It wasn't a replacement, it was a response. Vanessa watched her son come alive again, not as a reaction to injustice, but as an artist reclaiming his agency. She'd seen him quiet, wounded, hesitant. Now she saw the weight shift off his shoulders, as the narrative finally began to bend around him, not despite him. The exhibit opened with lines wrapping around the block. News crews, celebrities, art critics, students, and families from across the country filled the museum halls. One wall was dedicated entirely to the phrase Elijah had spoken in his bedroom. "I'm not for sale." Beneath it, his artworks glowed under soft lighting, each piece telling a story that no headline had captured. There were sculptures of broken tools repurposed into delicate shapes, wire frames of angelic wings suspended from the ceiling, diagrams etched into glass. Part science, part memory. It was raw and refined at once. People stood in silence. Some cried, others stared for long minutes, afraid to move. But perhaps the most powerful moment came from a small installation in the corner. A single display case holding a blank sketchbook and a mirror behind it. The plaque read, "For those who were told not to begin." Every visitor saw themselves reflected. Every visitor left different. Elijah stood at the back of the gallery with Vanessa, watching silently. He hadn't walked the room fully yet. He'd let others experience it first. As much as the exhibit was his, it now belonged to anyone who had been corrected out of their own story. That was the point. But not everyone in the room came to celebrate. Halfway through the evening, a murmur ran through the crowd near the entrance. Phones came up. Eyes shifted. Attention was immediate, not chaotic, but tight, controlled. Elijah turned slightly, expecting a celebrity or another journalist. Instead, he saw a familiar face step through the arch of the gallery door.
Dr. Grant Ellison.
He wore a black blazer, crisp shirt, and a practiced expression of stern neutrality. His hair was neatly combed, his pace measured. He did not glance at the art. He moved directly toward Elijah, cutting through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a man who had never been told no. Vanessa instinctively stepped forward, but Elijah raised a hand to stop her. Ellison came to a halt 2 feet away, surrounded now by a half-circle of silence. The cameras were rolling, some from press, some from smartphones. "Elijah," Ellison said, voice even, low, "we need to speak." It wasn't a question. Elijah looked at him, unflinching. "We are." Ellison hesitated, eyes darting briefly to Vanessa, then to the nearest sculpture. "You've shaped quite a narrative," he said, "but I believe you've left some things out." The room froze. No one interrupted. "Not yet." Ellison continued. "Critique, especially in the arts, is not always gentle. I regret how you interpreted my comments. But this," he gestured vaguely toward the exhibit, "has turned into something larger than it ever needed to be." Elijah's jaw tightened. But he didn't look away. "You didn't critique me," he said. "Clearly, you ridiculed me, and then your colleagues tried to erase me." Ellison's voice dropped, but his tone sharpened. "Be careful. Not every stage is safe, and not every audience lasts." It was meant to intimidate. A reminder that prestige, even bruised, carried weight. But Elijah didn't flinch. "Then you should have built something real, not a reputation." Gasps moved through the crowd, not from volume, but from truth. Ellison's composure cracked for a moment. His lip curled slightly, his posture stiffened, and then without another word, he turned and walked out. Cameras followed him, but the spotlight stayed behind, on the boy who had refused to be bought, mocked, or erased. Elijah didn't move. Vanessa stepped beside him, heart pounding. "You okay?" she whispered. Elijah turned to her slowly, his voice calm. "I think I just outlived the man who tried to end me." Dr. Ellison appeared at the exhibit and confronted Elijah publicly. The gallery's energy hadn't settled after Dr. Ellison's sudden appearance and quiet departure. Every person inside the museum, from students to celebrities to critics, knew they had witnessed more than just an awkward moment. They had seen power shift in real time. Elijah didn't speak as he walked through the crowd and stepped outside into the night air, where cameras, press, and TikTokers waited with record buttons glowing. The confrontation wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Under the harsh glare of camera lights and cold Boston skies, Dr. Ellison stood poised, trying to maintain the dignified presence of a man whose world was not crumbling behind his eyes. But his jaw was tight, and his hands trembled slightly, betraying his discomfort. A reporter asked the inevitable, "Do you have anything to say to Elijah Carter?" Ellison adjusted his collar and began speaking, his voice calm, clipped, and distant. He claimed his words had been misunderstood. "In academia," he explained, "challenge is part of growth. My comments were taken out of context. The media thrives on selective outrage." He never said the word sorry. He never addressed the real issue. When Elijah stepped forward from the crowd, the space shifted. The cameras turned. The air thickened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You weren't misunderstood," Elijah said. "You were comfortable." The statement hit harder than any accusation. Ellison blinked, confused, trying to respond with an intellectual pivot. But Elijah didn't stop. "You didn't critique my work. You ridiculed it. You humiliated me. You made sure others knew it was okay to laugh too." His words weren't about revenge. They were about reclaiming the space that had been taken from him. Ellison pushed back weakly, suggesting Elijah had mistaken criticism for cruelty. "Art must transcend personal grief," he said. "You interpreted guidance as rejection." But Elijah, with calm clarity, dismantled him. "You call it guidance when you get to decide what voices are too loud. You call it critique when you teach us to shrink ourselves, just to fit your comfort." He paused and added, "You didn't evaluate us. You filtered us." The crowd was quiet, absorbing every word. A single reporter asked if Ellison had really forwarded Elijah's work as a laugh break. He stuttered. "I may have among peers spoken casually." The crowd bristled. "You demeaned a child," someone muttered. The silence afterward was heavy. It was no longer about who was right. It was about what was exposed. Ellison tried to recover, talking about excellence, about his decades of dedication, but Elijah interrupted him gently. "Whose excellence?" The question landed like a final blow. It wasn't just for Ellison. It was for the entire system that upheld him. Ellison faltered. His mask broke. He turned, said nothing more, and left the cameras behind. The next morning, every news station replayed the confrontation. Elijah's composure, his clarity, and his refusal to be bullied into silence dominated the conversation. For once, the headline wasn't about a boy who had been victimized. It was about a boy who had drawn the line and exposed the system behind the insult. Within days, Ellison resigned. His statement used terms like pedagogical misalignment and professional fatigue. But everyone knew the truth. The resignation was a retreat, not a decision. But Elijah wasn't done. Harvard's board met in an emergency session. The result: a departmental restructure, independent oversight for faculty, student review panels, and a re-examination of long-standing practices that had insulated discriminatory behavior under the guise of rigor. Policies changed. Walls cracked. Elijah remained silent through most of it. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't want this to be about punishment. He wanted it to be about purpose. But the cost had been enormous. Privacy lost, peace shattered, and a childhood buried beneath headlines. Vanessa stood beside him, watching as the system finally bent beneath the pressure of undeniable truth. "You didn't just survive him," she whispered one evening. "You ended the story he tried to write over you." A week later, Harvard called a press conference. The board chair stepped to the podium with the usual weight of institutional regret. He announced a new initiative, a scholarship for underrepresented artists. It would be funded by donors and given annually. The audience waited to hear the name. "We will name this scholarship after someone who has defined artistic standards for decades," the chair said. "It will be called the Grant Ellison Fellowship for Artistic Rigor." The room froze. It wasn't a tribute to Elijah, not Chantel, not Rach, not the students who risked everything to speak up. They named it after the man who caused the damage, the man who laughed. A scholarship was announced, but not for Elijah. When Harvard unveiled the Grant Ellison Fellowship for Artistic Rigor, They framed it as a tribute to creative resilience. Yet the name missing from the announcement was deafening. Elijah Carter. Once again, the institution found a way to make itself the center of redemption, honoring the very figure whose legacy had been built on silencing voices, like Elijah's. To the public it was clear, erasure had returned, this time disguised as progress. The outrage reignited instantly. Social media flooded with criticism. Artists, activists, and educators condemned the decision as another loop in the cycle of selective justice. Hashtags like "say his name" and "erase erasure" began trending again, as people asked how a university could claim change, while celebrating the man who triggered the entire reckoning. But Elijah and Vanessa didn't respond with protest this time. They didn't issue a press statement or demand Harvard correct itself. They had already learned that institutions apologize in carefully worded paragraphs, but rarely yield their power. Instead, they chose a different path, one rooted not in reaction but regeneration. They decided to create their own space, free from the politics of elite institutions, and designed for those who were often told they didn't belong. At their kitchen table, lit by the same lamp that once witnessed grief, they envisioned something radical, a foundation for Black youth creators, not just a scholarship but a sanctuary for potential. Elijah had spent the last few months receiving offers, invitations, even movie pitches, but none of them felt as urgent or honest as this, building a movement that couldn't be renamed or rewritten by people who had never lived the cost. With support from the Smithsonian, individual donors, and a wave of grassroots backing, they launched the Carter Foundation for Emerging Black Voices. The foundation was designed to fund youth-led art initiatives, provide mentorship, sponsor exhibitions, and create creative hubs in cities across the country, starting with Boston. The momentum was immediate. Applications flooded in from young artists, whose stories mirrored Elijah's kids, whose ideas were called too urban, whose designs were labeled unrefined, whose expressions of culture and identity were dismissed in classrooms. The Carter Foundation didn't ask them to assimilate. It asked them to lead. Curators and cultural institutions joined in, not as gatekeepers but as partners. Workshops were hosted, dance distributed, and online platforms built to showcase new talent on terms set by the creators themselves. When the foundation held its first public gala, the room was filled not with celebrities or art world elites, but with creators and educators who knew what it meant to be overlooked. The gala's theme wasn't prestige, it was reclamation. The stage wasn't centered on one name, but illuminated by many. There were teens who had drawn murals on school walls, elders who had taught quilting as a form of resistance, and musicians who blended hip-hop with spoken-word archives. Elijah stood in the background for much of the night, watching with quiet pride as something bigger than him began to unfold. Vanessa, standing just off stage, looked at her son with a deep and quiet knowing. He hadn't fought for a seat at Harvard's table. He had built his own, and opened it to everyone who had ever been told their story was too small, too angry, too loud. But as the night wound down, and the applause turned into mingled conversation and laughter, Vanessa stepped away to take a breath. Her phone buzzed in her palm, an unknown number, no caller ID. She answered cautiously, expecting another media inquiry. "Vanessa Carter?" the voice asked. Smooth, professional. She paused. "Yes, speaking. This is the White House." Her breath hitched. The voice continued without pause. "We've been following your son's story, and more importantly, the foundation you've launched. We believe what you're building is essential, and we would like to discuss a potential national partnership, something federal, long-term, and centered on creative equity for underrepresented youth." Vanessa didn't speak right away. Her eyes scanned the gala hall, landing on Elijah laughing with a group of young artists. For a moment she was back in that school cafeteria, watching him place a strange little tree topper on a table, while the world turned against him. And now, someone from the highest office in the country was asking for a meeting, not to fix the past, but to help shape the future. The voice on the phone asked if she was still there. Vanessa pressed her hand to her chest and smiled faintly. "I'm here," she said softly. And for the first time in a long time, being here didn't feel like surviving. It felt like building. Vanessa received a call from the White House. The invitation arrived, like a pulse in Elijah's inbox. Subject line: White House Youth Arts Summit. Invitation to speak. It was not a request for commentary. It was an acknowledgement. A recognition not of viral clicks, but of meaning that rippled deeper into the cultural soil America seldom admits it till. Vanessa read the message aloud in their living room, where sketches and models still leaned against the walls like quiet witnesses. The phrase Youth Arts Summit shimmered in the air between them, the kind of words that carry weight without shape, yet this time felt like sunlight breaking through long winter clouds. Vanessa's voice caught once, then steadied. "They want you to speak," she said softly. Elijah didn't know whether to feel honored or exposed, but beneath that uncertainty was something unfamiliar and profound: possibility. The days that followed were a careful choreography of preparation and reflection. The Smithsonian offered support, refining Elijah's speech without shaping its substance. This was his narrative, not a script to tick boxes. He walked through drafts with Vanessa, his voice quieter than usual, tempered by the gravity of what it meant to stand in a room where the nation's story of art, youth, and equity would be recounted under glittering lights of political power. They worked not to impress but to articulate what truth feels like when it refuses to be muted, when it insists that excellence must not be defined by conformity, but by honesty, struggle, and resilience. When the day arrived, the summit hall was carved with symbolism, white columns rising like questions against a backdrop of rich blue drapery, and in the center, a historic chandelier hung like a constellation that once existed only in books. Reporters murmured in the wings, capturing every arrival, every expression. But Elijah did not see pomp. He saw lineage, history meeting possibility on common ground. His recreated tree topper, heavier wings, a brighter heart of light was displayed prominently near the dais. It was no longer an ornament. It was an emblem, defiance transfigured into structure, dignity made physical, brilliance born from the scrap of grief. When Elijah stepped to the microphone, the room fell into silence that felt like invitation rather than demand. He did not begin with criticism. He began with an acknowledgement of ancestors whose voices had never been asked to speak at tables like this. He spoke of his father, of loss that taught him to create rather than collapse, of every child who was told their cultural language was too niche or too emotional for academic spaces. His words were not acerbic. They were insistently, heartbreakingly human. He did not ask for forgiveness. He demanded understanding. And in that room, beneath the chandelier reimagined as starfire, people listened. Behind him the recreated topper glowed quietly, its light pulsing like breath. When he finished, the room did not erupt in applause. It did something more peculiar and more powerful. It held still first, like it was absorbing something heavy and precious. Then it leaned forward in recognition. Some delegates wiped tears. Some aides looked at their notes and suddenly found they made less sense. The White House press corps exchanged glances. And when the applause finally came, it was not perfunctory. It was reverent. Afterward, a cadre of artists and advocates approached him with proposals, collaborations, and invitations. They spoke not as benefactors, but as peers. One renowned sculptor told him she saw in his work a new definition of structure, not as hierarchy, but as interdependence. A museum director confessed she had often overlooked voices like his because she was trained to see art as distant from lived reality. And he reminded her that brilliance often begins in the places that must be before it is believed. Yet through the accolades, Elijah felt a subtle tension, the tension between being honored for a moment and being understood for a lifetime. Recognition, he realized, was not the same as inclusion. Scholarship wasn't the same as belonging. And genuinely redefining excellence meant dismantling old hierarchies without erecting new ones in their place. In private conversations that evening, Vanessa observed Elijah's gaze move beyond admiration, toward contemplation, as if he was asking whether this moment was an echo of change, or a challenge in disguise. The next morning, as they walked onto the White House lawn under a sky so blue it felt painted, Vanessa asked him what he saw that others might miss. He paused, looking up at the stately facade. "I see power trying to define meaning," he said, "but I also see the possibility of making meaning outside its walls." Vanessa nodded, sensing his dual current of humility and determination. "You're not just speaking for yourself," she said gently. "You're speaking for the ones who haven't been invited yet." His eyes softened. "Exactly," he replied, "and that's bigger than any stage." But then came an unexpected twist that neither of them saw coming. An email delivered quietly the same morning, before the summit address, marked confidential, Harvard University Board of Trustees. Elijah glanced at its subject line and almost scrolled past it, but something made him stop. The message opened with acknowledgments of recent structural changes, the departmental reforms, faculty accountability measures, and the fallout from Ellison's resignation, but then shifted tone, exposing a layer no public statement had ever revealed. The email contained a link to internal research commissioned by the Harvard board weeks earlier, during the height of the scandal. They had asked outside consultants to analyze why the uproar had not just dented Harvard's reputation, but fundamentally challenged its definitions of artistic legitimacy. The consultants' findings were astonishing in their bluntness. Harvard's historic evaluative frameworks were systematically exclusionary, privileging Eurocentric standards and marginalizing art tied to cultural identity, lived experience, and community narrative. In technical language, the report described decades of bias coded as rigor and discipline. But the twist, the part left out of the board's public restructuring, was this. The report's final recommendation was not merely procedural reform. It concluded that Harvard should incorporate Elijah's recreated design into its permanent curriculum as a case study, not as inspiration, but as foundational structure. They argued that his interpretation of symbols, memory, and personal narrative had rewritten a blueprint for what art could be in a modern, diverse society. The board concluded that its own legacy could no longer be taught without it. The email ended without signatures. No praise, no apology. Just a directive: revise curriculum to include Carter model as essential study. Elijah read the words slowly, his breath catching in his chest. The room on the White House lawn felt impossibly wide. Vanessa studied his face. The mixture of disbeliefs, satisfaction, and something tender, like consequence shaped into recognition. You didn't just change a moment, she whispered. You changed the foundation. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, the weight of that truth settling into his bones. He had not sought accreditation from the very institution that once dismissed him. Yet now they were being asked to teach his work as essential. Then he thought of the original topper, the one made in grief, in quiet solitude, in a small apartment in Dorchester. It had become more than a symbol. It had become a movement. But despite everything, despite national recognition, museum exhibits, federal invitations, and academic curriculums shifting, there was one piece of the story that remained unresolved. The email didn't mention it, and Harvard didn't return it. The location of the original tree topper remained unknown. And still, the original topper's location remains unknown. If you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or told your work wasn't good enough, this story was for you. Type yes in the comments if you believe every child deserves to be seen for their brilliance, not dismissed for their background. What would you have done if Elijah was your son? Don't forget to subscribe, because every time we share these stories, we get one step closer to rewriting what justice really looks like.